All right, everybody, welcome to Gen X News. We are streaming live right now on YouTube, on X, of course, and on Rumble. I encourage you guys to subscribe to one of those platforms if you want to get in on the live show. We are Gen X on Rumble, and apparently it's difficult to find the Gen X News on YouTube if you're not subscribed because Gen X is such a popular term. So I'm going to try to fix that, but I encourage you to subscribe on Rumble. I'm going to try to play around with the title on YouTube so you can find it easier. But for all the links, of course, go to genxonx.com, and the YouTube, the Rumble, and the X links are there. You can subscribe on any of those channels. And of course, on that website is the links to some of the audio platforms for the podcast. And you can get this all across all of your podcast platforms if you prefer to listen to it audio and not live. I prefer to have you guys come live here and ask questions because I have a great show today. I have Dr. Dean Bertram returning, and we are going to be talking about one of the earliest UFO incidents in the United States. If you guys don't know anything about the Maury Island incident, with the UFO incident, you're going to learn about it today. I just want to give you a little bit of Dean's background before I bring him in. Dean is kind of a connoisseur of everything UFO in our culture. He has his PhD in history from the University of Sydney in Australia. His doctoral dissertation was titled Flying Saucer Culture, a Historical Survey of American UFO Belief. He has publications in 14 Times, People Magazine, The Spectator, and The Australian. Dean is also a filmmaker who runs the Midwest Film Festival, and he's recently been in several film festivals. He has his current documentary, The Shaver Mystery, in a lot of festivals, and I believe he may have even won a few awards. It's an amazing documentary. You should check it out. I'll put his website up in a few seconds. But even more importantly, Dean runs his own podcast called Talking Weird. And of course, I will put up Dean's link so you can go to his website and find all of that information. It's www.midwestweirdfest.com. Podcast is that / talking weird. Let's not put it off too longer. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Dean.
Well, Melissa, it's always so much fun to talk to you. So thank you so much for having me back. I'm looking forward to tonight.
Oh, it's great. It's great. So how's the festival scene going?
The fest scene's doing really, really well. We just actually this past weekend played H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival, which was a fest I really wanted to screen at in Portland. And we also screened at the Fortean Film Festival in the UK, which is another fest I desperately wanted to film at. We have a lot of, I'll just tell them quickly, because if anybody is interested in the Shaver Mystery, or if you don't know what it is and you want to look at where a lot of the ideas around UFO belief come from, and who are the people who are responsible for a lot of the things we believe today about UFOs, it really starts with the Shaver Mystery. So this documentary is screening at a number of places. I'll just say the October ones, there's one I was after as well, but it's screening in Brooklyn Sci-Fi Film Festival, which runs October 14 to 20 in various venues in Brooklyn. It's screening at Milwaukee Paracon on October 19 at the Irish Cultural and Heritage Center in downtown Milwaukee. I'll be there presenting the film and talking about Ray Parn and Richard Shaver, and I would encourage anybody to come along and chat to me, because I'm going to be there for the whole fest or the whole convention, and I'd love to talk to people about this. That same day, it's screening at Berlin Sci-Fi Film Festival in Berlin at 6 p.m. on October 19, and on the weekend of October 19 to 20, it's also screening at the Festival of the Unseen in Parkersburg, West Virginia. It's screening near you, Melissa, in Provo, Utah. I think you're kind of in that part of the world.
Oh, really? Yeah, I'm really close to there.
At FilmQuest, you should go. It's one of the greatest genre festivals in America. I was so excited. And we just got nominated at that festival for Best Documentary. So if we win there, I'd be very happy. It's going to be stiff competition, though, so I don't expect to.
Yeah.
That's 24th of October to November the 2nd. And then screening again in the UK at the Black Sunday Film Festival, their special Halloween event at Everyman Chelmsford on Saturday, the 26th of October. So if anybody, again, is interested in this kind of stuff, I think they dig dig the film, and they probably dig the festivals it's screening at because they're loaded with weird stuff and sci-fi things and the paranormal. So all of those events sound just spectacular.
Well, that's great. We have somebody in the chat that lives near Maury Island.
Yes, Vashon Island, as I found out when I visited Maury Island. So I visited Maury Island on the 77th anniversary of the Maury Island incident, which we'll be talking about this year. I was lucky enough to be shown around by our mutual friend and colleague, Bob Antone, and his wonderful wife.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's part of the upcoming documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. The Shaver Mystery is kind of a segment from that feature, which I've amended to kind of stand alone, and I thought I'd just test it on the festival circuit. People seem to be enjoying it, which is great. But so I went out to Vashon Island. You get the ferry across from the mainland near Seattle. And Vashon Island now is attached to Maury Island. Apparently there used to be a gap, but the tides have changed, or there's more debris or something between the islands. I don't know what happened, but now Maury Island and Vashon Island are the same island.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, I have a little video clip to play, and then we can get into talking about Maury Island. I am a blank slate, so Dean, you're gonna take up the narrative, and I'll just interject questions when I'm like, that's interesting. But here's a little clip. Here we go.
The first well-known report of what became associated with the Men in Black phenomenon occurred in 1947. In June of that year, Harold Dahl, a civilian pilot, witnessed a group of UFOs while flying near Maury Island in Washington state. Dahl also reported that one of the UFOs had exploded, releasing debris and causing the death of his dog. Following the incident, Dahl and his associate, Fred Krisman, received a visit from two mysterious men dressed in black suits who warned them to stay silent about what they had seen. These men reportedly knew specific details about the encounter and its aftermath, raising suspicions of their origins and purpose. That is all.
I just thought it would be cool to set the tone with a creepy little man in black. Oh, you're muted.
He's creepy, that little man.
Oh, there you are. I can hear you now.
That was the Men in Black messing with us, messing with the audio.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so where do we start with the Maury Island incident?
Like so many things in this space, it's always difficult to decide exactly where to start because it's interconnected with so many things. But as that little man in black just told us, Harold Dahl operated a boat which did essentially kind of lumber retrieve in Puget Sound. Puget Sound is the body of water between Maury and, as you mentioned before, Vashon Island and Seattle or Des Moines. So the Pacific Ocean is on the other side of Maury Island and Vashon, and in between the Pacific and the mainland is Puget Sound. So they were operating there. Harold Dahl and his crew and his son and his dog was there as well, were operating a boat doing lumber retrieval. And they'd get the lumber and they'd sell it back to, I guess, the lumber companies which had lost it when it had fallen off boats and the like. When they were out in Puget Sound on June 21, 1947, above them in the air, they noticed this craft. The term we use today would be UFO, or then shortly after that, flying saucer, but it was actually a flying donut. It was hollow in the middle. And this flying saucer or flying donut started to look like it was having some type of trouble. It was kind of shaking in the air, and it started to spew out of its center essentially molten metal, which was falling into the water below, and steam was coming out of the water. And Harold Dahl and his crew decided to try to get away from this because it looked quite dangerous. And they essentially ran their boat into the shore of Maury Island, and the object passed over their boat and dropping more, I guess, slag or molten metal, and it injured Harold Dahl's son's arm, and it killed their dog supposedly. And they went and hid behind the logs which were on the shore. There are still logs on the shore today, which is kind of funny. And eventually other craft, which were very much like this craft, I think there were 5 others, flew in and surrounded this craft, and then they all kind of flew away. Now, when Harold Dahl took the boat back to the mainland, he told his who this character is we can get to as well, and this will be a part of what we're going to talk about tonight, but a mysterious figure called Fred Chrisman. Various accounts say Fred Chrisman was Harold Dahl's boss. Others say he was an associate or a friend or whatever, but they took it back and they showed it to, let's say, his boss, because that's what the narrative always used to say, Fred Chrisman. The boat was damaged. And Fred Chrisman at first thought, oh, they must have been drinking or something. You know, they've just made this weird tall tale. But the top of the boat was damaged, indicating it's not like drunken people running a boat into the shoreline. There was damage from above, like something had fallen on it. So Fred Chrisman supposedly went out the following day, I believe. And when he went out to Maury Island, he saw another one of these crafts, as if it was looking for something on the shoreline. Anyway, both Harold Dahl, and we'll get to the Men in Black part in a minute because the narrative jumps all over the place, but Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman boxed up some of this debris which had fallen from the in trouble flying saucer or flying donut, because it hit the boat and hit the shore of the slag or the metal was everywhere. And they shipped a box load of it to Raymond A. Palmer. Raymond A. Palmer is one of the two featured subjects in my documentary. And Palmer at the time was the editor of America's most successful science fiction pulp magazine called Amazing Stories. He was the editor of a number of magazines under the Ziff Davis publishing group, but Amazing Stories was his baby and his favorite. And when Ray Palmer received that letter, and he had contacts with Fred Chrisman before, which we'll also get to, he realized this is an interesting story. By the time he received it, or by the time they sent him this, I remember it happened on June 21. 3 days later, on June 24, is where Kenneth Arnold, who is generally thought of in most UFO histories as the first modern flying saucer witness, or at least the first flying saucer witness that triggers that actual term. So Kenneth Arnold had been, on June 24, Kenneth Arnold had been flying near Mount Rainier. He was a private pilot and a businessman who sold fire control equipment. And he was flying near Mount Rainier. And he saw 9 strange craft that were moving at what he thought was an incredible speed past Mount Rainier. And the interesting thing is Mount Rainier hovers over, like when you're on the shores of Maury Island, as I found out when I went there this year for the 77th anniversary, when you're on the shore of Maury Island looking out back east towards the mainland, Maury Island's right there. You can see it. It's like it's the most prominent feature when you look back towards the mainland. So supposedly 3 days after the Maury Island incident happened, Kenneth Arnold, but at the time, remember, Maury Island hadn't been reported. Nobody knew about it except Harold Dahl, supposedly, and his crew and his son and Fred Chrisman. But 3 days after that event, Kenneth Arnold has the saucer event, which we get the term flying saucers from. It was headline writers and newspaper authors described Arnold's sighting as he saw flying saucers, even though Arnold had never said that. It's a long story why they actually decided to use the term flying saucers, and most people used to think it was simply because Arnold said something like, oh, they moved these 9 fast flying silver crescent-shaped objects moved like saucers would if you skipped them across water. But recently, Chris Orbeck, who is one of the greatest researchers in the field today, wrote a book called Saucers, The Origin of Disc-Shaped Craft, or something I think it was called. But let's just say Saucers by Chris Orbeck. And Orbeck pointed out something everybody had forgotten. The term flying saucers was a very popular term in America for decades beforehand, because flying saucers was it was a slang word used for clay pigeons. When people shot clay pigeons, they called them flying saucers. Nobody knew this until Orbeck's book from last year, but for whatever reason, the press decided to use the term flying saucers to describe what Kenneth Arnold had seen. So it's that event on June 24, which made flying saucers the headline material across the world. It was picked up in every news service almost on the planet. It was all over the world. This man flying near Washington State, near Mount Rainier, had seen 9 strange flying saucers. So back to where we were after Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl send the debris to Ray Palmer of the Maury Island incident. By the time they sent it and by the time Palmer received it, Kenneth Arnold's story had dropped. Flying saucers was one of the most headline-grabbing things in the US at the time, and Ray Palmer, realizing a good story when he saw it, said, "This is an amazing story. How am I going to cover this? Oh, I know. I'll hire America's most famous flying saucer witness, Kenneth Arnold, the man who the whole story came from, to go and investigate Maury Island." So Kenneth Arnold was contacted by Ray Palmer, and Ray Palmer said, "Hey, will you go and check out this weird thing that happened in Maury Island for me?" And paid him, I think, I've heard different accounts, from $200 to $500, whatever it was. It was a sizable
That's a
sum
lot
for
of
the time,
money in
at
those
least
days.
at least to cover his expenses. And Kenneth Arnold went to investigate. And that's where that's the stage where I suppose that's the setup for the Maury Island incident anyway. And it gets even weirder, but I suppose that's where we'll start the story.
Well, interesting, because before I came on, I was saying it seems like 1947 was a busy year for UFO sightings. Do you think that a lot of these sightings in 47 set the tone for the iconic UFO in film and everything in the future?
Yeah, they set the tone for everything. The summer of 1947 is referred to as the summer of the saucers, and for very good reason. Firstly, it's where Kenneth Arnold, as we mentioned, has the sighting which kicks it all off, June 24, 1947. But if we rewind to the Maury Island incident, which doesn't become apparent until afterwards, that's June 21. If we flash forward a couple of weeks, we hit Roswell, which takes place around supposedly July 4th, right, in 1947. And those are probably the three most central UFO stories which set the tone for everything that follows. And it's ironic because today, most people who aren't into UFOs seriously don't know what Maury Island even was, right? But up until 1979, 1980, nobody knew what Roswell was, which sounds crazy when we talk about it now, because when the Roswell incident happened and the Army Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico, sent out a press release shortly after the incident, I think it was around July 4th, maybe the release went out a little bit afterwards, saying, "Oh, U.S. Army Air Force discovers, crashed flying saucer, or recovers crashed flying saucer." The very next day, of course, the Army Air Force retracted that story. And unlike today, where people would have been like all conspiratorial and what the devil's going on, they're lying to us, everybody forgot. As soon as the U.S. Army Air Force retracted that story, it wasn't a thing in ufology anymore. Like, I have two, as I always say this, because I think it's telling. I have a number of UFO encyclopedias, but the two major UFO encyclopedias around 1980, they were both published in 1980. One by Margaret Sachs was the I guess the person who put that one together, and Ronald Story put the other one together. Neither of those documentaries even have an entry for Roswell. I don't even think the term Roswell appears in either of those encyclopedias. Now, if you get an encyclopedia about UFOs today, anyone published post 1980 something, Roswell's its own section, right? It's a major part of the narrative. But up until 1979, when people started talking about it again into 1980, nobody in ufology had even thought about this since 1947. So it was forgotten. But the Maury Island incident remained a thing for a very long time. Like, if you look at UFO books in that interim period between 47 and into the 70s, people are still talking about the Maury Island incident as that original iconic UFO crash or UFO incident. But I think post Roswell capturing all the interest going forward, everybody's in a way forgotten about Maury Island.
That's interesting, how it switched. Do you think there was something about Maury Island that stuck in people's mind immediately at first that was different from, say, Roswell? Like, was it the Men in Black thing, or I don't even know what, like, we haven't even really gotten to that part.
We will.
In depth. But there is something kind of spooky about it.
Well, I think one of the main reasons, ironically, is again one of the main subjects of the documentary I'm doing, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, Ray Palmer, because it's Palmer who realizes the story of the potential, interest that this might have when he hires Kenneth Arnold to go and hunt down that tail. And Ray Palmer shortly thereafter launches Fate magazine, and everybody knows what Fate magazine is today. It's still on the newsstands. It's the world's longest running paranormal magazine. It was launched by Ray Palmer in 1948. And the very first issue of Fate, and some people will be familiar with this, has an artist's rendition of Kenneth Arnold's sighting of the discs above or near, or the crescents near Mount Rainier. So Palmer employing Arnold to write for Fate, and in the second issue as well, there's more from Arnold, and then turning those stories into one of the first UFO books, The Coming of the Saucers, which covered the Maury Island incident in length.
Oh,
And Arnold wrote that with Ray Palmer, and Arnold definitely had a hand in the writing of it. They're both like the two, both of them are credited as writing it, but it's pretty clear from most people who are familiar with Ray Palmer's writing style that Palmer had a massive influence on forming and shaping that narrative into creating that first conspiratorial UFO crash story.
so that's just what he focused on.
Well,
And
he beat the drum. In other words, to answer your question, why Maury was so important early on, it's because Ray Palmer beat that drum really, really, really hard. And so it became front and center in UFO believers' minds because A, Fate was the magazine in this space, and B, Ray Palmer published the biggest flying saucer magazine for the next probably 20, 30 years, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, and then it had various subtitles, but we'll just call it Flying Saucers from Other Worlds, Flying Saucers from Outer Space. Let's just call it Flying Saucers. That was the major UFO magazine in America for probably 2 to 3 decades after Palmer launched it. So this was part of the mythology that, and when I say mythology, I don't dismiss it and mean it didn't happen, but it was somebody who was in the UFO field keeping the Maury Island incident front and center in people's minds, certainly for at least the early stages when all of this mythology, and again, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, it just means it's what becomes the important aspects of the story. And it was really Palmer's doing, to answer your question. And the Men in Black, the whole Men in Black story originates in Maury Island. That's why we have the Men in Black. It starts literally there.
Right. That's a spooky element to any of these UFO. I always, when I would see movies, and I think I've seen this in other instances where they say, people will say, this happened to me and Men in Black showed up. And they don't just say like just people in suits. They say like spooky men that aren't normal, I guess you could say, that there's something weird about them. And so I don't know, should we get into what like the Men in Black thing? Is it too premature, or should we talk about
jump
that?
right into it. I think it's
it's
interesting.
Because I almost felt like they weren't even human, but maybe they are. I don't know. What's your take? What happened with Maury Island? Like, so we've talked about the incident, but where do the Men in Black come in?
That's a very good point, because the incident happens on June 21. That's when the incident happens. But the second part of the story, the Men in Black part of the story, happens on June 22. So we talked about how Harold Dahl was running a salvage boat in Puget Sound, and that's when he and his son and his crew experienced this event with a UFO that essentially explodes, or at least starts dropping material above them. The following day, Harold Dahl gets a visit at his home by what today is a traditional man in black, somebody wearing a black suit and black hat and driving a black Buick or something from the time period. And he says, I know what you saw yesterday. Let's go and have a conversation about it away from your family. And so they go and they meet in a cafe. And the man in black, very much as and he wasn't termed a man in black yet, that's what we call them now, but he was a man in black. He was dressed in a black suit, did what we are used to hearing. He told the scared, I suppose, Harold Dahl everything that he'd seen. But how could the man in black know? He wasn't there, but he knew exactly what Harold Dahl had seen, exactly what he'd experienced, which is a very common motif going forward in Men in Black lore. And then he warns Harold Dahl not to tell anybody, if he knows what's best for him and his family, not to tell anybody about what happened to him. And so that is the very first Man in Black record that we have in modern UFO belief. It's so early, obviously, in the game. It's at the very beginning of the whole UFO or flying saucer
Right.
phenomenon as we think of it in the modern era. And that sets the tone, perhaps. And again, this is talked about by Arnold and by Palmer, and it sets the tone for Men in Black lore going forward. In fact, Gray Barker, who writes the book that popularized it even more, another one of the most famous early flying saucer books called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. I think Barker publishes that book about 4 or 5 years after the coming of the saucers in 51. And Barker does a couple of things. One, he starts the book with one of the greatest overviews of the Shaver mystery I've ever read. Like, Barker has this really
Mhm.
wonderful overview at the very beginning about the Shaver mystery and how this this is all part of it. And then he talks about Dahl's experience, and then he goes on to other flying saucer witnesses who are having similar experiences with Men in Black. And he really kicks up the notch to another level. And then after Barker, of course, John Keel just starts calling them MIB. He does. That's where we get the MIB,
Right, right.
Um, uh,
Will Smith.
yeah, exactly. That's so. This all leads to that Will Smith thing, but and I think you made a very good point before, because you said maybe they're not human, or maybe they seem very unusual. It's interesting because there are reports where they sound potentially like government agents messing with people, and I think the Harold Dahl one, I don't think the man seemed particularly um,
Out
metaphysically
of this
weird, you
world.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
sounded more like maybe flesh and bloodish, maybe, who knows? But certainly when you get into the stories in Gray Barker's book, they knew too much about flying saucers, because he's writing about Albert Bender's experiences. Albert Bender, shortly after that, was running one of the major flying saucer clubs, I guess, in America. There were a lot of them. People would start these little flying saucer clubs the same way today people start ghost hunting, groups or something. The reason
Right.
Albert Bender's one is remembered, and I think it was called something like the International Flying Saucer Association or something. The reason it's remembered is because Bender said all of a sudden, I have to shut this down. I've been threatened. I've been visited by 3 men in black. And Barker writes a book about his experiences. Again, they knew too much about flying saucers, and then later Bender does his own version of the story. But those men did seem to be more metaphysical. They seemed to be, or not flesh and blood. They seemed to, appear and disappear and behave in all kinds of weird ways. Later, John Keel, who I mentioned before, who many of your listeners are probably familiar with, the Mothman Prophecies, Keel's most famous
Mhm.
book. John Keel recognized that people had experiences. Often the men in black didn't seem human. They often dressed out of time, for starters. Their dress and their cars, they'd often pull up in cars that seemed to be like in like 1960, 1970, perfect cars from the 40s or 50s in perfect vintage shape. Their dress would be old fashioned. Their face shape would be weird. It's politically incorrect to use this term today, but I think Keel did. They'd almost look like they were Oriental. They didn't look like they were your average government agent in 1960s America. They'd ask strange questions. They'd respond weirdly if they picked up like a household object, like, I don't know, a pen or an ashtray, or you gave them something to eat. They didn't
Yeah.
seem to
They
quite
didn't
be able to
know.
handle it. They seemed not to be human, basically. But maybe there are two different types. Maybe this phenomenon has things that are government agents coming and saying, listen, be quiet about that thing you saw. And maybe it's because it was a test US project or something. And then maybe
Well,
there is some
that's
weird
the obvious
manifestation.
one, is that it's the government, and they've been caught doing something really that they don't want the public to know about. Let's just say that. Hmm.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
that's
that's
obvious.
right.
That's the obvious reach.
I think they
But
might be two things, though. I think really there might be two different things going on.
doesn't okay, so I read somewhere that it, they start saying that it's a hoax because he denounces and denies that he saw it later, but then I'm reading that he did that because he had so much harassment or something. There's people who are trying to now revive the case and come up at it and say no, it wasn't a hoax. So
Mhm.
what really happens with that, with him denouncing it?
That's a good question. So yeah, Harold Dahl supposedly later came forward and said, when he was under pressure and being investigated, said, "We just hoaxed this man, Chrisman. This was all like just BS, and just, we're sorry." But then supposedly, and I believe this aspect of the story is true as well, because when I was in Maury Island, and on the other side in Des Moines and the Seattle area on the mainland, I went to the Men in Black birthday bash, because now they have a festival there that celebrates. It's so much fun. Everybody dresses up like a man in black, and it's like a party. And
That would be my game. I always wear black.
you would love it, Melissa. It's so good.
Oh, that's funny.
But Steve Edmiston is the festival founder, and I think the festival director. And he's actually an attorney, and he's an historian, and he and what's his name, Scott Schaefer, made a narrative short film about the Maury Island incident about a decade ago now. In fact, I think they just had their 10th anniversary screening. But Edmiston has done a lot of research, and part of his research unearthed that, and this is fascinating, is that in the field office of Des Moines or in Seattle, or that part of Tacoma, that part of the world, back in 1947, it would kind of be the boondocks for an FBI agent then. Like, it wouldn't have been an important office. But the FBI investigator who was there at the time talked to Harold Dahl even after he recanted the story. And Harold Dahl supposedly told this FBI agent, "It all happened. I just didn't want the harassment of being this kook who'd seen these saucers or donuts or whatever they were. And I would rather be thought of as a practical joker, hoaxer, than somebody who was mad or, was just,
Right,
full of all of this
insane.
crazy." That's what he told the FBI. The fascinating thing is, apparently, J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI at the time, was fascinated with the flying saucer phenomenon early on. Like, he was very interested in the whole phenomenon. And the junior agent in the Boondocks was writing to Hoover, who just thought we could dismiss all this as nonsense after he'd heard that Dahl had recanted, and said, "No, Harold Dahl," and this is a junior officer in the field, directly
Right.
communicating with J. Edgar Hoover. Like, it's unthought
Wow.
of. There were protocols of, what I mean, channels. It's like today, you don't talk
Right.
to the head of the FBI if you're just a field agent.
Right.
And the field agent was essentially on Dahl's side, saying, "No, this man clearly saw something. The reason he recanted had nothing to do with him actually having committed a hoax. He just was feeling like he was being persecuted and bothered, and so he came out
Right.
and said this never happened."
Right. Trying to make everybody go away almost. Because I'm sure it gets overwhelming to deal with stuff. And like, if you lived in the Amityville horror house, you'd be like, "No, it's not haunted. It's all a
Exactly.
hoax." You just want people to stop coming by and leave you alone, right? Whether it's haunted or not. I mean, you wouldn't admit to it. I wouldn't want people coming by my house all the time, filming it and taking pictures and parking on my street because they think satanic spirits are there.
Exactly.
So I wouldn't want people bugging me forever about a UFO. And I don't know. I mean, if you're 1947, you have the experience. How would you know that people would get crazy about it? You wouldn't have known because there's no
There are
template before
cans down
that to
there
show
too,
you.
Chloe, I can open.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no template beforehand to sort of tell you that you're going to be, in this sort of
Exactly.
media hysteria, really. So fair enough to him, but I'm sure the FBI was happy that he said he never saw it, because that makes their job easier if they were involved.
I think it makes everybody's job easier. And of course, why the Maury Island incident seems to resonate, at least for me, and seems to have an aspect of it which is more sinister, is that when Kenneth Arnold went to investigate, he called another pilot friend of his in, who was also a famous witness at the time. And that's why he became why Arnold called his friend in, because his friend how he actually met him was, his friend was also had seen he was a pilot and he had another very famous sighting. And so Arnold, when he was sent by Palmer to investigate the Maury Island incident, called in his friend, Captain Smith, who was a commercial Air Force pilot, and not Air Force, commercial airline pilot. And they both suddenly began to feel seriously overwhelmed by what was going on there. It just seemed strange and it seemed sinister. And for example, they shared a hotel room and they started to get phone calls from a local journalist going, I don't know what's going on, but we're getting phone calls from somebody saying they know everything you're talking about in your hotel room. And the journalist on the phone would say, they said you said this, and then they said you said that, and then they never gave up to the journalist that that's exactly what they've been talking about, but it's exactly what they've been talking about. So they got paranoid and they thought, is somebody bugging the room? They spent hours pulling the room apart.
Right.
Kenneth Arnold makes a reference saying, I'm just glad I brought my handgun with me because I'm glad I could sleep with it under my pillow. They got really scared. So Kenneth Arnold called the Air Force of two of the Air Force investigators who had talked to him about his sighting. And so he said, something's happened in Maury Island. It's super weird. And so they flew in, the two Air Force bombers, the two Air Force air officers flew in an Air Force, like I don't know, was it a B-52? It was an aircraft bomber anyway. They flew in, they piloted it to Tacoma. They flew in to investigate. And when the Air Force officers came in, they talked to Palmer, they talked to Smith, who was also Arnold, and they talked to Smith, who was also investigating with Arnold, and they talked to Fred Chrisman, and they talked to Harold Dahl. And when they were leaving, they seemed to be dismissive of the case, the two Air Force officers. They were like, well, we're leaving. We've seen enough. We've worked, whatever. And when they were leaving, Fred Chrisman, who was the person that is normally referred to as Harold Dahl's boss, he said, no, I've got wreckage you should take with you. I've got components of these things that blew up above us. And he gave them in a cornflake box of all things, all of this slag which they'd collected. And apparently the Air Force officers weren't that interested, but they took it anyway. But here's the rub to the story. So they get aboard their plane. They're the two pilots of the plane, the pilot and the co-pilot, and they fly back from Des Moines. They're going back to the Air Force base, or the Army Air Force base, that they have been sent from. And this is the period in history where the Air Force dissects from the Army. Like they used to be the one force. Like there wasn't an Army and an Air Force. There used to be an Army Air Force, right? This is when the Air Force dissected from the Army and became or disconnected from the Army and became its own force of the U.S. military.
Right.
And it was literally coming up on Air Force Day, the first day when they were celebrating. So the pilots wanted to get back to base so they could celebrate. So they flew out, supposedly, according to Ray Palmer, who sent Kenneth Arnold there to investigate originally. When Kenneth Arnold tells him, the two Air Force officers are going back with this debris that we've got, supposedly Palmer told Arnold, do not let them fly back. They're not going to get home alive with this stuff. This is what Palmer said years later. But Arnold was like, well, this is just, we don't even know if it's flying source of debris. How can it be dangerous? We're still investigating. So he didn't stop the pilots from flying back. The pilots had two other people on board. I think the different versions of the story say they were crew, or different versions say when you used to fly, it's still the same. I think if you want to get a flight to another place in America, and if you're on leave and you're in the Air Force, you can just go on the next plane there, you can sign up and they'll take you. The Air Force themselves will take you. For whoever they were, there were two other Air Force members of the Air Force aboard the plane, and somewhere between them leaving Tacoma and them not too far out, I think they were near Kelso, Washington, the plane started to have troubles. One of the engines, I believe, failed. The two pilots told the two passengers to get parachutes on and jump the heck out of the plane, and the two passengers did get parachutes on and jump out of the plane. The two pilots, who were the two investigating officers, lost control of the plane and it crashed near Kelso, and they both died. And the wreckage from Maury Island went down with them.
That I was going to ask if they had any of that debris, and that answers that question. That is really a little bit too much of a coincidence that would happen.
I know. That's the part which makes it super sinister. And this is where we get so much of whatever the case was, so much of this conspiratorial ideas that surround ufology, whether they're right or not, comes from the Maury Island incident. That's why it's so important. This is where we get the first kind of flying saucer crash debris. This is where we get the first Men in Black appearance. This is where we get the first conspiracy that might have killed 2 Air Force officers to cover up, because one of the stories says that plane was shot down by essentially a Mustang, what is it, the P-51 or whatever the US World War II fighter plane was. That's one of the things which Ray Palmer said later he had been told. Another story, which actually was in, was in the newspapers at the time, was that some kind of anti-Air Force gun and shot that plane down. So whether that's true or anti-airplane, gun and shot it down.
What?
So whatever's true or not, is the story started to circulate that these officers had debris from a flying saucer kind of crash or malfunction, and they had been killed to perhaps silence them or to retrieve the wreckage or who knows what. But there was something conspiratorial happening.
Did anybody talk to the people who escaped the plane and the parachutes?
Yes, that's another interesting thing, and this is in it's a wonderful piece of audio I have in the film with Ray Palmer speaking, because Ray Palmer died in 1977. But this is a piece of audio I got from Richard Toronto, who is the author of this wonderful book called War Over Lemuria, along with other books about Shaver and Palmer. But War Over Lemuria is a good place to start. And anyway, Richard Toronto gave me this piece of audio of Raymond Palmer at a UFO lecture back in the day. And according to Palmer, a journalist talked to one of the 2 people who bailed out of the plane because he'd broken his leg and he was taken to a hospital near Kelso, and got this story from him that, something had attacked the plane maybe, and he'd had to bail out and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, supposedly, according to Ray Palmer, both of those men were disappeared essentially, and they were no longer contactable. Something happened to the guy who was whisked away, who was the passenger, the Air Force crew member who was the passenger, and the reporter himself also disappeared and was no longer.
Well, you never know. They could have done anything. They could have been like, oh, they're mentally ill, put them in a mental institution. I mean, anything could happen with the government in charge.
That was certainly Palmer's interpretation. Yeah, that was what Palmer was suggesting. They'd been disappeared back in 1947.
So this is pretty serious stuff. If they're whacking people and people are just going missing and planes are crashing, what do you think? I mean, why do you think they would want to do that? What do you think's there? Is it technology they don't want people to find, or any? Is there any? Obviously, there's theories.
Yeah, there are theories. I mean, perhaps the most prosaic theory would be this is all just a big coincidence. What, the plane happened to go down, it's just that had nothing to do with the Maury Island crash, had nothing to do with the Maury Island debris. That's the obviously easiest way to dismiss it all. And maybe we just lost.
Conspiracy brain is not buying that.
I know. Well, even I'm not, and I don't know how conspiratorial I am or not, but I'm certainly also suspicious of what happened. Perhaps some of the secret, if there is one to be found, might lay in one of the key players in the story who I mentioned before, and that's a very mysterious figure called Fred Chrisman.
Okay.
Fred Chrisman had already been in contact with Ray Palmer years before the Maury Island incident. We've talked about the Shaver mystery, I believe, before on your show, and that's the subject of the short documentary that I have screening in festivals at the moment. And long story short, and I'll do it really quickly, somebody called Richard Shaver wrote a letter to Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer was the editor of Amazing Stories from the late 30s into the late 40s, so probably over a decade. And Richard Shaver suggested that he was in contact with these beings beneath the earth. Some of them were evil, they were called the Dero. Some of them were good, they were called the Tero. And they were the remnants of an ancient civilization that had long left this earth to escape the poisons of the sun. And still we were being visited by people from outer space who had contact with the Dero and the Tero. And this was all before the flying saucer mystery started. And we could go into more of it, but it kind of set the tone for much of what was later believed in UFO belief. Like ancient astronaut theory was already all there, visitors from outer space was already there, humans being abducted by non-human entities was already all there. So the Shaver mystery was a big part of the Amazing Stories popularity from about 1944 through about 1947, 48, when the publishers cancelled. The people told Ray Palmer, the editor, that he couldn't run Shaver Stories as true anymore, because Ray Palmer was running Richard Shaver's stories about this as fact, and it annoyed some readers. It annoyed a lot of major magazines in America, like Harper's wrote about it, Life wrote about it. It was a well-known thing in America. The Shaver mystery was on everybody's lips. Everybody knew what the Shaver mystery was, even if it wasn't the people reading it. It was a well-known thing in the US. Anyway, during that period when the Shaver mystery was filling the pages of Amazing Stories, Fred Chrisman wrote a letter which was published in Amazing Stories saying, "Stop looking at this stuff. It's dangerous. When I was a pilot during World War II, I was shot down in Burma, and I fought the Dero that you're talking about, these evil underground aliens in caves in Burma, and they shot me with a laser, and it burnt a hole in my arm. Just stop looking at this stuff. It's dangerous." Anyway, it's Fred Chrisman who is the direct link from the Maury Island incident to Ray Palmer shortly thereafter, who sends Palmer via his friend Harold Dahl all of this debris that they collect. It's Fred Chrisman that forces essentially on Air Force officers who don't really want to do or investigating more debris from the Maury Island crash. Now, there's been various theories about maybe Fred Chrisman was trying to cover up the secret technology that crashed there by being made by a company like Boeing or somebody. There's all these different weird stories. The interesting thing about Fred Chrisman, so we've already pointed out that he was involved with the Shaver mystery, which was the proto-UFO story of the mid-40s before flying saucers broke into the headlines. He was part of the Maury Island story, a major part of the Maury Island story. I mean, he's a major figure both in the book The Coming of the Saucers and in the various stories that evolve from there. But decades later, he is among the witnesses that Garrison looks at when he's investigating the Kennedy assassination as a possible shooter at the JFK assassination. And there's theories that Fred Chrisman is one of the three figures of the three tramps which they capture in Dallas near the grassy knoll, because when police started to panic after Kennedy was shot and they started to round people up initially, supposedly there were who were called the three tramps, and there's a photo of the three tramps who were captured by them, and they were they were held, I think, briefly as potential suspects in the Kennedy shooting before it was all worked out. And some people have said Fred Chrisman is one of those three tramps. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Chrisman was also involved in politics in the Des Moines area. Very strange figure. Where he had a kind of an early conspiratorial conservative radio program, which was super. It was almost like, I don't know, a proto Rush Limbaugh come Art Bell type stuff. And he was a teacher for a period as well. And he got in trouble at the school. He was teaching seniors, I think, and he developed a secret society at the school that he had senior students members of. So Fred Chrisman is a super weird figure, but forget all those last things I said, which just it's difficult to even get a hold of them. The fact that he was involved in the Shaver mystery, a key player in the Maury Island incident, and later was looked at by Garrison as a potential assassin in the JF Kennedy assassination. I mean, it's weird that one figure pops up that often in so many of the central conspiratorial ideas of the 20th century. It's just very, very weird, super weird.
So Chrisman is a superior officer to Dahl. Am I
Yeah,
getting the relation? I'm trying to understand
it's
the
hard
relation
to
because it's weird that he pops up all these other places.
it's hard to work out because the I think the original narrative was like somehow they were harbor patrolmen and Fred Chrisman was like the senior officer over Dahl, but they weren't harbor patrolmen, they were doing lumber salvage. So the initial narrative I think was they were harbor patrolmen, which sounds different to lumber salvage people. The next
Yes.
story is it doesn't seem like Dahl was actually employed by Fred Chrisman. It seems like he knew Fred Chrisman, and it seems like there's all kinds of different weird versions of this narrative. Whatever, the only thing I'm comfortable saying is that Harold Dahl knew Fred Chrisman and they both
Okay.
contacted Ray Palmer, and Fred Chrisman was part of the narrative and was the person who fostered
Okay.
the material.
But
And he was also the
but
one
it
who did all the speaking, apparently. Like when they were being
that's
interviewed, like
weird.
Chrisman would do most of the speaking, and Harold Dahl, who'd had the original experience, wasn't saying much. It was
It
Chrisman telling
it
the
feels
story.
Here's how it feels to me because that's what I was asking. Did Chrisman have experience? But Dahl had the experience. It feels like he's kind of being controlled and groomed by Chrisman
Yes,
to
I
me.
agree.
Because that's weird. Because I'm like, how does he fit in this? And I was trying to check the Wikipedia, and I'm like, okay, superior officer, like what's going on?
It's
Right.
weird.
So
It's hard to
it,
work out. It's very slippery, the whole narrative. It's hard to get a
it
real
is
hold of it.
because I'm like, how does he know him? And now you're saying they were logging. I'm like, well, why would you have a superior officer? Or a
Exactly.
boss maybe. That's really bizarre. It sounds like a lot of shifty stuff. It feels like to me like he's just there to make sure that this doll guy says the right stuff and doesn't say the wrong stuff.
Yeah, I agree. It could very well be that. It's super
I
weird.
don't know, guys in the chat, you tell me what you think. If anybody's still there, let me know what you think about that, if you have any theories, but it's bizarre. His appearance there just seems really off.
Yeah,
And then you
it
say
seems like
he
he was
found
managing.
here and he had the debris, and then he might have been a JFK on the grassy knoll. And I'm like, okay, this guy's giving me some kind of grooming FBI vibes.
Yeah, I
That's so
will.
bizarre.
It's super weird. I'll tell you a funny side story, which is because we were talking before about the debris going down in the plane and the cover up and everything. Of course, some of the
Mhm.
debris had already escaped before this, and the debris that had escaped was what was sent to Ray Palmer by Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman. And I've known about this story forever, as anybody who's seriously interested in UFO lore is. And so when I was making the documentary and I was able to track down Ray Palmer's son, Raymond B. Palmer, who still has a piece of the Maury Island wreckage. And people knew this, incidentally, just it was never talked about. Like a few people knew it. Raymond B. Palmer, Raymond A. Palmer's son, still has a piece of the Maury Island debris. And so and when I went to his house and visited him, he was very gracious and he pulled this thing out and he said, "Do you know what this is?" And he gave it to me and I said, "I absolutely know what this is. This is a piece of the Maury Island debris." And he's like, "Yeah, it's the last piece we've got. My dad gave a lot of it away. And this is it." And to hold it,
What did it
whatever it is, regardless of what it is, to hold a piece in your hand, because it's
what
such
did
a
it feel
massive.
like to you?
I mean, I think I was probably more affected knowing the historical significance of the story, whether knowing what it was or wasn't. It's probably somewhere around, I don't know, 3.5 to maybe 4 inches, long by, a couple inches wide. And it's flat. It's probably like less than half an inch, in width. And it's a dark metal. Now,
Mhm.
when Raymond B. Palmer's father, Raymond A. Palmer, had it tested, and he had it tested supposedly at a number of places. He had it tested, I think, at the University of Wisconsin, I think by U.S. Steel and by some other university in the Midwest. According to Ray Palmer, and these results are in the Coming of the Sources, and also in an interview where he talks about it. Um, they all said they thought it was like slag. It was like, just a kind of byproduct of, I guess, the steel making process or something, whatever slag is. But they said one interesting thing about it was that it had a very high calcium content. And calcium is meant to burn off at, I don't know what Palmer said, like 800 degrees Fahrenheit or something. But they tested
Mhm.
this metal up to something like, I'm just trying to vaguely remember the figure, 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, like some ridiculous industrial
Right.
level of temperature testing, right? And
Mhm.
the calcium still didn't burn off. And why Palmer said he thought that was significant is, and I don't know if this is true or not, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a cultural historian following the
Right,
narrative,
right,
right?
right.
But Palmer said supposedly calcium in metal is a very good protector from radiation. So he was talking this on the eve of the space, or during the space race, but certainly before we'd gone to the moon. And Palmer was saying things like, "We need this to why this is important is you would need it to protect uh, in atomic energy and nuclear reactors. You also need to protect people who are going out into space from high levels of radiation." And Palmer didn't come to a conclusion of what that actually meant. But the implication, of course, is if there's a metal with a very high calcium content pouring out of a UFO, maybe it's there to protect people from either space radiation out there or to protect them from something, radioactive
Apparently,
here.
it didn't help the dog. Oh
No, well,
goodness!
the dog got belted with it supposedly.
Wow. Okay, so do you think? I mean, there was, 1947's post World War II. There's obviously, we're coming up to, well, a perceived Cold War and eventually a space race. Do you think, there's a lots of stuff about Nazi UFOs and World War II, and they had stuff like that. I'm not going to get totally into that, but do you think they were trying to do space race testing and space travel
Maybe.
then? Yeah.
Maybe. I do think that I don't know if I agree with it, but I'm very sympathetic
Hmm.
to the idea. I don't The reason I don't necessarily agree with it is because I don't think you need to have such a complicated working model. But I am sympathetic to the idea that the Roswell crash might be what some commentators have suggested, and that is that the Roswell cover up and crash was actually us experimenting with Nazi technology from people we brought over with Operation Paperclip, and what went on
Hmm.
there had something to do with technology we're testing, and that's why the cover up was so aggressive. Now,
Because a
whether
lot
that's
of people
true,
say it's a weather balloon and they stick to that and say that the debris proves that, but I don't know if that's true about the Roswell.
yeah, there's one version, which I also a version I'm sympathetic to, which was written by a couple of academics along with somebody who was part of a secret high altitude test balloon program, which took place around the time the Roswell wreckage was recovered. And in that book, the person who was involved with tracking the balloon said we lost one around Roswell at that time period, and supposedly, unlike a standard weather balloon, which everybody would have known what it looked like, their very high altitude one, which I think was to test for radiation in the atmosphere to see if the Soviets were experimenting with nuclear
Right.
weapons or atomic weapons. Supposedly, a lot of the features of that balloon resemble the features of things which witnesses report about the Roswell wreckage. In other words, the strange hieroglyphic type insignia. They'd use something on those balloons, which it wasn't meant to be that type of, it wasn't meant to be hieroglyphs, but it could conceivably have been interpreted by that, like the tape that they were using looked like it, and the fabric itself was very different to normal weather balloon fabric, like it was metallic-y, and if you did crunch it up, it would kind of flatten out again. So that story, and I think it's just called something like UFO crash at Roswell or Roswell UFO crash. It's quite convincing, and you might need to have a more complicated version, like I just talked about, the Operation Paperclip version. But I'm still sympathetic to that because I can imagine that the US government wouldn't want. And it's true. When you think about what happened with Operation Paperclip, we know that's a fact. We know that we brought in all kinds of Nazis after World War II. We just fought this horrendous war. And you can imagine Americans being really angry. Not that they're like, well, we've captured some Nazi scientists and we're using them, but we brought all these Nazi scientists in and they're living the life of Riley. They're having a great time and they're like American. Like you
Yeah.
can see Americans who just lost a
Seems like
brother or being mad,
seems like
right?
the government keeps doing stuff like that with over and over. What's good for the government, and they don't care what's good for the people. So but I ask that because there is a lot of I don't trust official narratives because I know they're all, they're made up by the government who, and we're really educated. We don't realize it, but we're educated and just as brainwashed as anyone in the Soviet Union in our education systems. And so we're told official narratives, and I know that they're way too simple to be what really happened. And a lot of evil, nefarious things are going on in world history that they're never going to tell. And it's one of the issues when I was taking history in World War I and World War II history in university. I would get in arguments with the teachers because they wanted you to have this ABC simple narrative. And I would say things like, well, I don't know. It seems like the fascists and the communists are kind of two sides of the same coin. And they would lose it and try to shame me in front of everybody. And I'd be like, well, okay, but I don't know.
You can't talk about the dangers of everybody's very happy, and rightfully so, to talk about the dangers of Nazism. We all know it's horrible, and fascism, we all know it's horrible. But in a university situation, because I've spent way too much time in the academy, you can't say the same thing about the Soviets or about any type of communism. But there's clearly no difference in a totalitarian regime. If you're being murdered because you disagreed with the state or because you had a business or whatever reason, it doesn't make any difference to you why you're being taken to the camp. And these various totalitarian regimes all operate in equally hideous ways.
Yeah, and people were so much more naive back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I think we're more desensitized now, especially with all the movies and stuff that we've seen. I just think that it would have been easier to, like, people would have just bought a narrative. They're like, oh, and same with a lot of boomers, like, it's on the television, the news tells us the truth, and why would they lie? Look at the presentation, it looks official. They say they're specialists, and that's where we're caught up in a lot of this propaganda. Somebody says they're a specialist, so you have to trust them. Otherwise, you're bad. Like, that's brainwashing. That's like Nazi, that's like Stalin style. It's not quite as violent, but it's still telling you, like, if you do not trust these people on a certain virus and you do not listen to all these authorities, you are evil, you are bad, you are a nutter butter, you're crazy, and you're not. And it just shows you how people are brainwashed to behave and be socialized a certain way. And I don't think it would be any different about UFOs. I don't want to be like you said, that guy didn't want to be thought of as a nutter. So he just said he made it up. It was easier.
I agree.
We don't realize how much we're brainwashed.
No, I agree. And I do think there's something, there is, and I'm not somebody who's mean to the boomers, but it's easy to be, because I do think that there are a lot of people of that generation still think the media is Walter Cronkite. I'm not even sure if you could trust Walter Cronkite, by the way. But I do think that today there are still people who literally think what you're told by somebody on the television has to be true, and that because there isn't any there hasn't been any time in their lives where they've been taught to be suspicious of what authorities tell you, or today, to be honest, what the corporate media tell you. Like, the reason you would, for anybody to think that a corporation, and we all know that what the media is owned by a few corporations, really, the major media here or in the world, why you would assume that a corporate interest wants to tell you the truth.
Yeah. No.
It's a madness. Like, would you trust them still if it was just, okay, we're the PR firm for fill in a corporation. This is the way things are. If that's the way it was presented, who would actually believe that? But that's the reality of so much of the media today. It's just the front for these massive global corporations, and whatever side of the political aisle you're on, the fact that you would think that the corporate media, and that's what it is, it's corporate owned media, would have any interest in telling you something that would affect its own influence or affect its own power. Of course they're not going to, any more than the PR company for a major corporation is going to tell you something which is against the interest of that company.
I've got a little clip here I can show about this. We'll pop back into Maury Island, but this just sort of shows you that real journalism, I'll say this, guys, has diversity. It has different titles. It held different people with different opinions, different sources. It won't be all homogenous, but here's what we have. And this goes to prove we're kind of brainwashed just like the Soviets.
One-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Yeah, it's so extreme. You guys are extremely, that's what I'm saying. That's what media is. And when you watch it like that, you realize, oh, they're just pumping a script from a central agency. And so like as if, and these guys can control anything you think about UFOs, about food, about diet, about wars, about how, if you're to have families or not, what kind of education. Now they're doing it on gender. So, I mean, it's crazy. They can control anything because so many people are hypnotized. And it's like, I don't know how someone could, if I showed them that clip, they could watch that and feel like the news is not a creepy Stepford wife, weird entity that's like a demon, and so I have no doubt that we don't know what's really going on, and especially with something UFO-y like Maury Island, or I don't know, Kenneth Arnold, or so yeah, we got into it, and I just happened to have this clip up, and I'm like, I need to show this because we're talking about it. It's astounding. It's astounding. And so they weren't talking about UFOs, but that just shows you how they can control the narrative, like about anyone, and make them look crazy.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that there are people who don't understand that there are very specific corporate interests that control what they consume, and that is, it's clearly the news, as that clip just proved, but it's also film, it's also music, it's also most of the ways that people consume any type of information or entertainment. It isn't like necessary. It isn't because you watch this channel or this channel you're really getting a different opinion, or you listen to this music artist or this music artist. It all goes through corporate boards these days. The same thing happens in television, in television series. It's why we see, and I won't go into the details, but it's why you see changes in portrayals of ideas on television very quickly, and it's carried through multiple shows. It's because it becomes a talking point, and it's just, well, we have to do this now. It definitely happens in newsrooms. We know there was the Veritas release of one of the heads of who was it? It was like, I can't even remember if it was CNN or MSNBC, but they had access to the tapes and them saying, well, these are the talking points. This is what we're talking about. And it's obvious that happens wherever you get your news from. If you think that there are journalists out there in the field breaking stories, and no, it's just, this is the talking point. This is what we're going to talk about.
It's
and we have to
not
talk
news
about this
anymore.
and this. Yeah.
It's not news. It's not breaking journalism. That's why it's so important that, independent journalists, have support. But I find it like, when you were talking about TV, like, I'm sure the X-Files really helped control how people see UFO narratives, and movies like Men in Black. It's putting it in this kind of comical version, or Independence Day, or any of those movies. They're trying to tell, form, even though they say they're entertainment, they're still forming an idea you have about UFOs or unidentified flying objects, whatever you may think. And
what are those messages, and whether they're true or not, it's very clear. If most people think the term UFO or UAP or flying saucer, they imagine a craft from an extraterrestrial civilization manned by, probably little gray men these days would be the popular one. But that's because of the presentation, for whatever the reason, that's because of the media presentation and the idea that the government somehow know and have access to the technology or are covering up. That's because of the media presentation. Again, and we have I don't fail to think that we aren't lied to, because I do think that we are, but I have no reason to believe that somehow the government has aliens hidden away in a basement and have, reverse engineered flying saucer technology, other than the fact that Hollywood has pushed that idea, and that the UFO community itself has pushed that idea. And this would be another show, we've probably done it before anyway, is that we know intelligence agencies have interjected or spun much of this type of narrative anyway to make people believe that there are UFO people or aliens having alliances with the US government. The US government knows what's going on. The US government has back engineered flying saucer technology. And for whatever the reason that those narratives are pushed out in the body politic, they've clearly at times been encouraged by the government agencies themselves, responsible supposedly for keeping this information under wraps. So you have to ask yourself, and I don't know the answer, but you have to ask yourself, why has this become the narrative that's been pushed via Hollywood, via, Intel spin campaigns, via all this stuff?
Well, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I'm not a UFO specialist or anything like that, but I look at the generalities of how they do it in general, and I think it just muddies the water. So it's hard to go back to the source and find out what was really happening. And I think that's what they don't want you to do, is get back to the source, raw, real investigations on any of these things, because that's where the real thing is and what they were actually working on. So it just muddies the water, and they might even interject some truth into it, so you actually doubt the truth, because you're like, oh, like as if there's aliens and they're doing that, and they might even wrap it in some truth, so then you take you throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it just muddies it all up, so it makes it confusing as to what's real and what's not.
Absolutely. And some of it mightn't be for us anyway. Some of these stories might have been fabricated for the benefit of the Russians or the Chinese. We don't know why these things are spun,
It's interesting, because I just did a show on this, and we're talking about oh, darn it, I forgot the name of it. Here, let me flip through my notes. I'm sure I have it somewhere, but it was I'll get it. It was the, I like to get this right. Yeah. Darn it. Oh, the Smith-Mundt Act gave permission for the US military, I think, to disseminate information that was kind of like propaganda, but they disseminate pamphlets and stuff, but on foreign bodies. In what year was that done? It was in the 50s. It gave people permission, the government permission to do that, but they weren't allowed to do it on American citizens. So, like, in an official way. But Obama undid that, I think, in 2013. something like that. So now they can actually push propaganda that they used to say, oh, we're just sending that to Russia because they're the enemies. And well, apparently now we're the enemies and they can push.
Gosh.
That's why you get all this propaganda going on TV. And that was done by Obama. He kind of gutted that act, the Smith-Mundt Act. Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
And so now, and so they might have considered making Hollywood movies not really propaganda. I don't know why. It's obviously, I think they did it before the Obama thing, but they just did in movies. But I think now in terms of news, they're really doing it in things that are official documents that look official. They're saying, well, now we can propagandize against the American people, and they can. That's why news is getting crazier and crazier as well. So who knows what will happen with UFOs. Now they can push UFOs as official too, maybe in the news. Maybe that's why we're seeing a lot of this stuff out in the media. But
Maybe.
I've had you here for almost an hour and 20 minutes. Is there anything else that you need to say about Maury Island and why it's so important to UFO culture?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be quick. I do think that when people talk about UFOs today, it's very easy to just go, oh, okay, well, the 2017 article in the New York Times, I read that and it's told me that the Pentagon have a secret project, and I've seen the Tic Tac videos. And my point is, I think it's easy to look at the way it's presented today and think you have a handle on what the phenomenon is. You can watch a congressional hearing, or you can watch, a talking head, blow out some story about what's going on today with US government secrecy or whatever, or whether you're watching Fox or CNN or wherever you get your news. But these things, all conspiracies and all reality of UFOs or not aside, it's difficult to get a handle on the depth of the UFO phenomenon without going back and looking at things like Maury Island and looking at the key players in developing that belief, whether that's Fred Chrisman and whatever his motivations was, or whether that was the people writing about it like Ray Palmer and Kenneth Arnold themselves. Like, if you don't understand where we've come from in the development of this belief, you are doing yourself a disservice just by thinking, oh, okay, I watch a congressional hearing, so I have a hand. You don't have a handle on any of it, because the history of this stuff, and it doesn't even really start in 47, it goes back into older occult traditions and older belief systems. And it takes a lot to really try to understand it within context. And I know we live in a society where we're not encouraged to understand things in any type of context. We're understand to hear and respond in sound bites. But something as complicated as a belief system, and again, I don't mean that dismissively. I mean, maybe there is something there, or maybe there isn't, who knows, but to try to approach something like UFOs, or the UFO subject, which is laden with beliefs which have shifted and changed throughout the course of the last 80 years, and again before then. If you don't think that you have a grasp on it if you don't bother looking at these older things, which is central to the stories like Maury Island, which we were talking about tonight.
Well, in a congressional hearing, they're going to ask questions, and they're not, they only have so much time, and they probably have a different agenda than just knowing the full history. And then they, like I said, they only have so much time, and all these congressional hearings cost money.
For sure.
Taxpayer dollars. It's kind of crazy. So that's interesting. Is there anything significant about Maury Island, like in terms of how it happened, that's different from any other UFO case? Like, is it that the shape, like, does it follow similarities with shape and stuff, or is it completely unique and that's why they wrote about it so in depth at the time?
Yeah, I think the real significance of it is when it happens. It happens so early in the development of this belief system. So there wasn't anything solid yet. There wasn't anything which really defined or locked off what the UFO or the flying saucer phenomenon was. When Arnold went out there to investigate, I think he was there in August, and he'd had his sighting in June, and the Maury Island incident supposedly happened a few days before him. It was very fresh. The papers of America which were talking about flying saucers, hadn't come to the conclusion that they were little green men from Mars or anywhere else yet. This was a genuine mystery. Is this the Soviets? Is this us?
Right.
What is this? So I think when you look at
Yeah.
Maury Island and you read, and it's worth reading The Coming of the Saucers. People should read it because you can look at it early on and you can see that there was a mystery there. Like when you read a UFO book today, there doesn't seem to be a mystery anymore.
Yeah, it wasn't really locked into the sort of green man stuff. Now,
Exactly.
is there, the last question I have before I turn out, is there a similar, are those three events in 1947, like Roswell, Maury Island, and the Kenneth Arnold one, are they connected? Do you think they're connected in any way?
I mean, as a cultural historian, all I can really say is they're connected culturally. I think you can't look at you can't look at one of them and not look at the other two, and not see, was there an influence in what was happening then on the way these things were being reported or understood, or the way they were later taken into UFO belief. I think the connection is, and this is the only connection I'd be comfortable saying there definitely is one, is the fact that they all happen so closely together in time. It seems that the summer of the saucers, and whether it was a mass hysteria or whether the skies of America were filled with things all of a sudden, whether those things were weather balloons or secret US projects or extraterrestrials visiting us from afar or interdimensional beings, whatever they were, there does seem to be an incredible flap that happened in 1947, which includes those, probably the three most important, probably are what we've talked about: the Kenneth Arnold sighting, the Maury Island incident, and the Roswell incidents. So that's the way they're connected, is that they're part of this initial, all of these amazing stories that affected the way we still think about flying saucer belief, came out really within a couple of weeks of each other. I think that's the connection.
Right. That's what makes me think there's more deeper, but maybe we'll never know. Because of the time frame. It's like if you look at all the murders for Jack the Ripper, you're like, oh wow, these are close together. Maybe they're connected to the same guy, we don't know that, but I'm saying, like, maybe it is. Maybe someone will find that one day. I don't know.
Right.
All right. Well, Dean, thank you for coming on and talking about this topic. I didn't know anything about it, and it seems kind of bizarre, especially with the Men in Black. And I don't know. I think personally, for me, that's probably the element that makes it even more iconic than the other one, is the Men in Black element. It's a little spooky. So
it is spooky, and it is fascinating. And I can't thank you enough for having me on. I always love chatting with you, Melissa. So thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I'll just put you in the green room here, and I'm going to tie this up. Everybody, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to try to do a show tomorrow night. Don't know. I've got some clips. We'll see what it's going to be. Stay tuned. If you subscribe on my X or on the Rumble, you will know. You'll see it pop up there. But usually I'll do it by 8 p.m. Eastern. That's usually when I like to do it because, I like to get to bed by 9, 10 o'clock. But visit my website, Gen X on X. All the links are there. You can subscribe on X, Rumble, or YouTube for the live stream. And, of course, you can subscribe on the audio podcasts. Those links are on Gen X on X. But we're available across all different platforms. You can also visit my guest's website at midwestweirdfest.com. And he also has a podcast, Talking Weird. So if you want to search that out, or Google Dean Bertram and subscribe to his podcast, he has amazing guests on. So he's every Tuesday. So you guys got to check out his show. And my dog is barking, and he's telling me to wrap this up. So I'm going to wrap this up, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in.